Hey guys, Ashley here. Today I'm bringing you one phenomenal guest, Zak Dychtwald. We're going to talk about China and Young China. Zak is an author of Young China and the founder of Young China Group. So what is this Young China and how does it impact innovation in the country? This is the topic of today's chat. Zak, welcome on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Zak, you have recently written a phenomenal article for Harvard Business Review talking about innovation in China. And you were talking about this huge pool of people that went through unprecedented change in China in the past 30, 40 years, and how they are the driving power of China's innovation indeed. And I would absolutely love my listeners and our audience to really understand a bit more about this point. Can you brief us on what's happening with Young China right now?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So the alternative title to the article, a little bit behind the scenes, is Innovation Overrated? When we look at China and particularly the US-China relationship, but really China's relationship with the world, we typically focus on innovation in a really narrow construct. There's something called the Global Innovation Index, which measures and ranks countries in terms of their ability to innovate. China ranks, I think, 14th right now. The United States is in the top 5, and the Nordic countries are typically in the top 3. But what those metrics typically overlook is the actual impact an innovation is able to make. Actually, the World Economic Forum did a great survey over these innovation indices, and they basically decided that they focus a lot on inputs but not outputs. When you focus on inputs, it's great to see what kind of great ideas somebody can think of. But if nobody's using that great idea, then it's not going to change the world. And so what I argue in this article is that what makes China's innovation ecosystem so phenomenal, so globally unique, and what ultimately is China's new innovation advantage, which is what the article is called, is not their innovators, who are increasingly globally competitive, but actually their hundreds of millions, up to 1 billion, depending on how you measure, population for whom adapting and adopting at an incredible speed is totally average. It's hundreds and hundreds of millions of people for whom their entire lives, the sort of mantra has been adapt, adapt, adapt. And when you translate that into a tech scene, that means adopt, adopt, adopt. And that is a power that can be world changing.
And why China? Why Chinese consumers? And I've lived in China. I actually moved to the country when I was 17 years old, and in 2005, 2006, it was a completely different country. That was the year when social media was taking over the world globally. And in China, people barely had smartphones. And then within a span of 1 year, everybody had a smartphone. Yes, a cheap one, a smaller version, but it was a smartphone. And then suddenly social media boom started happening. And we had, you remember those Weibo wars. It wasn't just one Weibo. There were many platforms trying to, compete in this microblogging. And then we had, later on more comprehensive social media platforms, then payments, then it turned into basically this e-commerce. I remember as a student, I was buying everything in China from Taobao because it was cheap, because it was easy. I knew it was reliable. I could ship it back. And then Taobao turned into, Tmall, and now this whole huge ecosystem that is a completely different animal. So why China is able to adapt, why people are, following this route? Is it the government? Is it the companies? Is it, the speed of change?
Well, you nailed what people typically focus on. So when outsiders typically look at China, they focus on 2 things. First is big government, which for a lot of us is scary. It's not a style of governance that a lot of particularly Western countries and citizens are comfortable with, familiar with, and particularly recently with a more adversarial tone between China and a variety of different Western governments. Whenever we think of Chinese government, we usually keep them at a distance. That's one thing, and we'll put that to the side. The other is the economy and these individual companies. We think about Alibaba, we think about Tencent, we think about ByteDance, and there's so much attention focused on how much money they're investing, the sort of investment ecosystems they create, and their impact on the market there. I'm actually arguing that it's neither of those. So when you're focusing on the consumer and when you're focusing on people, by the way, the only difference between a consumer and a person is whether or not they're holding their wallet, or in China, it's their phone at that particular moment. So we're talking about basic sociology. You have to look into the sort of developmental ecosystem of the population in China. And what I'm arguing in this is that over the last 30 years, and really when I talk about young China, this is what I'm talking about. Over the last 30 years, China has experienced, the average citizen in China has experienced an order of magnitude, so a full order of magnitude more change than almost anyone else on earth. And so when I talk about that, I'm talking about people witnessing their village turning into a town, turning into a city. I'm talking about people remembering when their uncle would sort of wheel a bicycle home back in the early 1990s as a great symbol of wealth and progress. And now they have a 2-car garage. We're talking about those incredible transformations that we usually do on a macro scale, but making that really personal. And then we're asking, okay, how would living through all of that change impact your worldview? How would it change your attitude towards money? How would it change your attitude towards your government? How would it shift your career ambitions? What would it change your worldview towards progress? I mean, it's this entire anthropological packaging that informs the way you see the world. And actually, tech adoption and adaption in that realm is only one articulation of this kind of sociological phenomenon. And these are a bunch of fancy words to basically describe if your entire world changes fast around you, what you get used to is change. And so fast changing tech is just one aspect of a fast changing world. It's more intuitive in China than in other places in the world. And there's some pretty phenomenal numbers around this. I don't know, Ashley, if you have, I know you have a very numbers oriented audience, but the numbers around this are pretty wild if I can share.
Please do.
So I'm born in 1990. I'm an American millennial. If I was born in California, if that's relevant at all. In my lifetime, I've watched our per capita GDP. So the basic kind of what does a life get you? It's not a perfect metric because it kind of bulldozes over the Gini coefficient and wealth disparity within a country. But when you're comparing countries globally, GDP per capita is sort of the best metric we have when you're thinking about the individual quality of life. So in my lifetime, in the last 31 years, I've watched our per capita GDP increase around 2.5 times as an American. Imagining that in really concrete terms, that means maybe the education my family could help provide for me 2.5 times better in my lifetime. Maybe the roads, the public services around us, 2.5 times better. Maybe the vacations we could take as a family, 2.5 times longer. It's helpful to imagine this in really concrete terms rather than just, sort of an economist's random jottings. My friends born in China in the exact same year have watched their per capita GDP increase 31 times in their lifetime. So an American, 2.5, Chinese, 31. Maybe it's just a developing country thing, right? India, we often compare China and India. India is actually the only place on earth with a larger youth population than China. That same period of time, really how much change has a millennial witnessed in their lifetime? In India is only 6x. China 31, India 6. Brazil, BRICS nation, around 3.2. Germany, the leader of Europe, 1.9. When you look at the top 40 economies today and you measure this, I call it the lived change index. How much change has somebody actually lived through in their lives? Every other country aside from China is under 10x. So what that means is we're sitting anywhere else in the world. If you're sitting in Germany, if you're sitting in Sweden, if you're sitting in the United States, if you're sitting in Mexico, and you're looking at the rest of the world, you can sort of predict how much change how much someone's environment has evolved around them, with one glaring exception, and that's China. And when you look at the graph on this, it's really shocking. And so it's not just, we focus on tech here, but it's also attitudes towards sex. It's also attitude towards family. I mean, there's a whole array of attitudes that have evolved faster in China than other places in the world as a product of a swiftly evolving environment and ecosystem that is truly a full order of magnitude faster than other places on earth. It's a sci-fi concept almost. It's like, Ashley, if I were to ask you, close your eyes and imagine an island where time moves 10 times faster. The inhabitants on the island, the way they use technology, the way they invent things, the way they see themselves, the way they see their lovers and their family. I mean, that evolves at a 10x rate. When you start to play around with that, it's a pretty wild concept. And it's not to say that China is like this techno utopia of the future. There's a lot of things wrong with it. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of people's willingness to roll with the punches and adapt to change, it's really in a class of its own.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. When I was a child, and I was born in the Soviet Union, so obviously a very different environment, right? And the first time I went to Japan, I remember seeing the escalator for the first time. So basically stairs, and they were moving. And I remember looking at it and thinking, oh my God, this is the future. Or remember the door, these sliding doors, maybe as a kid, growing up in the US, and we are almost the same age. So growing up in the US, you've probably seen them from day one. I don't know. For me, a door was a door that you pull or push, and suddenly you come up to the door and they are just slide opening. So for me, a trip to Japan was a visit, basically visiting the future. I remember it so vividly. So right now, I always tell people, you want to see the future, really go to China. We have holograms, 3D displays. We have tons and tons of things when it comes to offline spaces, even more when it comes to online ecosystems and infrastructure. And indeed, the optimism with which people are jumping on that train, I think, is quite unique. And of course, yes, I believe what's different in China as well is that when people jump on this technology train, they actually see the benefit. In the West, we tend to see more negatives, like, oh, I'm giving away my data, or if I submit myself to blah, 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 then I'm going to be spammed by this provider for the rest of my life, something like this. So sometimes companies also, abuse that trust and really track us everywhere. And we just feel that we are not getting a fair deal out of it in the West, plus many, many, many other attitudes that kind of get and are added into that cocktail. But in China, people say, you know what, if Alipay knows all my insights and my history for the past, 10 years, that's also okay, because I do not know, pay my mortgage through Alipay. I can board the plane with Alipay. When I need to apply for birth certificate for my child, this can be done through government services on Alipay or within a couple of minutes. And people feel that, this is the way it is, and that's okay. And what about optimism? I also feel that, this desire to adapt is not only because people saw change, and change was the only constant in their, life for the past 30 years. But I also feel that Chinese consumers are particularly optimistic about the future. They're usually more optimistic than, the rest of the world. And this might or might not, and I would love to hear your thoughts, be connected with Chinese culture. Because in China, it was always very, very important to study, to advance yourself, because this was the only way, starting from early dynasties, to actually you could start as the peasant. As long as you could study, as long as your family could feed you, you could actually enter the court, and you could, through your own kind of virtues, become a scholar and and move up and be successful. So do you think it also has anything to do with this optimism and culture, underlying culture?
It's a good question. And I would say more than optimism, I think it has a little bit to do with inevitability. When you think about the way that technology is rolled out in China, there's a certain amount of being willing to go with the flow. And there's a lot of really fascinating questions that come from this. Is it because they're part of a government system that doesn't require as much participation? So there's not as much questioning of things as it's rolled out. And that means government things, but it also means technology. Once technology is broadly accepted, there is less distrust of that. Versus, in Americans, if there's any sort of clause written in like this tiny little piece of legislation, then there's going to be 3 different riots about it. Which, there's good and bad of both without any doubt. But sort of the distrust of new things is sort of built into other systems. It's less built into China's. So optimism is definitely part of it. I think when you think of the older generations in particular, I mean, this is in a way one of the most incredible parts of China's evolution over the years. I talk a lot about young China. In many ways, old China is more phenomenal because you have people who grew up in the Cultural Revolution, real brutal poverty. You have to remember, if you're above the age of like 65 today in China, you have lived through a famine that killed tens of millions of people. I mean, you're a survivor. You're not just tough. You are a survivor. And then if you think about that, and remember, they also missed a whole, an industrial revolution. So this idea that today you have older people swiping on Pinduoduo and are like fully integrated into the digital economy and know how to use mobile payment and are comfortable with it and are sending voice notes to their grandkids and are interacting with 8-year-olds over, in their own digital ecosystem. I mean, it's that spanning of time in a way that's the most science fiction of all of this. So optimism is part of it, particularly with the older generations. I think inevitability is a real factor here. And so it's not to say that government is foisting this on people. They're not. This idea that, the government did privilege Tencent and Alibaba in the case of mobile payment with banking charters. And that was kind of an incredible forward-leaning movement that threatened the monopoly of state-owned banks at a time when China didn't appear to be particularly forward-leaning on a lot of this legislation. On the other hand, its adoption by hundreds of millions of people was at no point guaranteed. And so that you see not just younger generations who, new technology comes out, they want to try it, but also the entire population and different social strata all willing to use it is something that is truly unique to what you're seeing in China, and certainly not being emulated in Western Europe and in the United States.
And I love that example in the article that you feature a guy who's a beggar, right? And obviously when the whole cashless payments became the thing, he started losing business. And I'm sure, our audience has also seen videos and pictures of beggars with their little QR codes, WeChat, Alipay. And apparently, these guys are actually making more, 30%. Sometimes even more than 30%.
300%. Hey, digital upgrading works. For all of you who are wondering, like, hey, should I digitize my products? It seems to work. And what makes the old Yang story so significant, and what I was really trying to emphasize there, is that I think when we think of innovation, we think of the heroes of innovation, right? We think of sort of the late Steve Jobs. We think of Jack Ma, sort of that one picture where he's gesticulating wildly to that group that's become so famous now. And that's great, but you're really talking about less than 1% of the creative class or the innovative class in any country. The point that I was emphasizing, and the story is about, just really briefly, is an older man who is a professional beggar, which is to say that it's profession. It's how he takes care of himself. It's how he takes care of his loved ones. He's done that for years. And of course, if you're in the profession of begging, then you're very cash reliant. And so for years, he was outside of a Beijing subway, sort of waiting for people to come up. They would reach into their pockets. They would take their spare change. They would put it into his cup. And that was his job. The problem was in 2014, 2015, people in China stopped carrying cash, seemingly overnight. So what did he do? He adapted. He bought the cheapest smartphone he could. He printed out a QR code. He went back and sat outside of the subway. By the way, it helped that smartphones are cheap in China and that was even an option. And then suddenly he was running a business where people were coming out and instead of dropping their loose change, which is like 20, 30 cents in USD or a couple of RMB, they were taking out their entire wealth, which is contained in your phone, and scanning the QR code and donating that way. And his sales tripled. But rather than the sales being the significant point, what's important here is that for someone like that, not just the tech leaders, not just even the Politburo folks who are really trying to push China's forward-leaning innovation boom, it's all social stratas within China who are just willing to adapt and adopt as changes come along, because that's just a fact of life.
It is. And I remember it was a couple of years ago, I was taking a train in China, a speed train. And you know how sometimes it stops in the middle of nowhere to pick up, I do not know, people, and then it goes basically full speed to Shanghai or somewhere else. So then there was a lady sitting on the train, and she was with a small child. And the basically baby was not very happy, basically said, "Mom, why do we need to go?" So maybe she's working elsewhere, maybe they just see each other for a couple of days, etc. So he's like, "Mom, why do you need to go?" And he said, "Oh, you need to go to school, with grandparents, this and that." And the child is like, "No, I don't want to go to school." And then mom, and she was clearly, maybe a cleaning lady, but maybe a factory worker, but definitely a person who is working with her hands. And she said, "You know what? If you don't study, what kind of job are you going to do?" And the little boy is like, "Oh, I'm going to be like you, mom." And she said, "When you're my age, there's going to be no people like me." And it blew my mind. A person who is working in a factory or in a cleaning profession, who is on the train in the middle of nowhere with a child, she is telling him that by the time you are my age, there will be no profession like mine.
What you're describing is there's an awareness of the way demography works in China, and frankly, a candor with the way that the government represents it. And this is one of those things that people don't really realize. I used to live outside of Chengdu University, and when I was writing Young China, I was 24, 25 at the time. So it's pretty easy for me to go in and out of class without anyone really realizing. And so I had a bunch of friends who would sort of alert me whenever there was, in China, there are mandatory government sessions. So you'll have somebody from the party who comes in, who explains the priorities of the government to a group of 300 young people at that university. And what was surprising to me, I think I went in expecting sort of a really glossy version. In China, there's a saying, 报喜不报忧, which means to report the good and not the bad, which is kind of what I expected. But instead, there was a party cadre at the front of the class who was explaining China's demographic issues. He was explaining how the workforce was not going to be able to replace itself. He was explaining how the future of China's, of the country relied on innovation. And then he explained to those young people how if they were not to innovate, their future was in question. He wasn't saying it was definitely going to happen. He wasn't saying that our success is an inevitability. And I think, I do this America comparison a lot, and forgive me for that. But I think there's a feeling that in movies that we grew up with, that we come out on top no matter what. I know that it's popular to talk about China's wolf warrior diplomacy, which is like a bad Rambo version of just like, that we will prevail. But for a lot of people, what they're being told is like, here's what's happening in China. Here's what our system needs. Here's what you can do to try to fit into it. There are other options if you don't want to fit into it. But here are the industries that we're going to be stimulating, which means there's typically good opportunities associated with it. But it was a really candid conversation. It was issues that I would have highlighted around demography, around education issues, around healthcare, and looking after the older population as they're reaching retirement, which is happening right now demographically. I was surprised and remain surprised by the level of candor with which the government talks about its own problems, not all of them, obviously. And of course, China's censorship is one of its more famous issues, but there's far more candor between the government and the people in terms of its priorities than is often represented to the outside world.
Absolutely. And that's why I always say that you want to know what China is going to do, just look at the 5-year plans. End of the day,
there's not a lot of ambiguity.
Yeah, this is what we're going to do in 5 years. And you know what? They said they're going to eradicate, from poverty, or right now we are after digital illiteracy, or we are after innovation, or you remember 10 years back, they announced entrepreneurship was right now the thing. And before that, a lot of actually families did not want their kids to become entrepreneurs because it was like, oh my God, we need to get, a better job, better pay. Entrepreneur is basically like jobless. You work for free and hope to sell your company, or you hope to really make it. But then they made entrepreneurship popular. They made a lot of things popular and possible. And if you want to see where China is going, it's no secret. There are 5-year plans and there are updates. And I think that's what you're saying. There is that level of candor and planning and openness when it comes to, hey, that's what we are doing, and we are really trying to build this joint kind of vision together.
Well, I mean, there's candor around the things that the country needs, and so there's sort of clear signaling about what's going to be supported, and there's a little bit of tough love rather than just we're going to be fine no matter what. There's like, look, these are the contributions we're looking for. I think this is relevant, particularly at a time where there's a lot of questioning about how a willingness to look at a collective versus an individual have shifted the outcomes of COVID infection. And obviously that hasn't been all of it, but within China, a lot of the communication is still focused around this idea of collective. And that's not just collective in terms of your family, it's collective in terms of their country. And there's some good and there's some bad with that. I think on the good side of that, there is a sense of shared responsibility. On the bad side of that, there's inevitably far more nationalism we're seeing now, in part because of an education shift that happened back in 1991. It's also because we're sort of stoking those flames from the outside. But it also, I mean, it's a double-edged sword. So I'm always reticent to say that things are wonderful or awful in a sort of boring, unsexy fashion. Moderation is sort of typically the key when thinking about China and its relationship with its government. But there's definitely more good than is represented from the outside, and there's definitely more bad than is represented from the inside.
Absolutely. And what do you think are the biggest changes in China since the COVID-19 outbreak? So China speed right now is not just China speed, but China speed on steroids. It has become an even more digital ecosystem. And of course, the sentiment of consumers or people, whichever way we want to put it, has definitely changed. So what's your take? What is different right now?
Yeah, so I mean, we think about this a lot. And if you look at the macro numbers, they're pretty impressive, right? Since July, China's been open. And when you think about China compared to the rest of the world, it's hard it's hard if you're a global brand, if you're a global company, if you're a global investor, to not be looking at China and salivate. And that was definitely the story of last year, particularly the quarters 3 and 4 of last year. What we're focusing on, and while there is definitely a really optimistic story to be told about that, There's an element that some of these numbers won't focus on that, as young China, I feel it's sort of responsible to bring to light a little bit, which is that if the rich have gotten richer and the poor have gotten poorer. And so if you focus only on the wealthy and the consumers, it's actually a really compelling story. Often, luxury globally, every luxury house, every luxury investor, it's almost the only story that people want to talk about in a lot of ways. And if that is the story that you're interested in, the China story has gotten even better. Because if you were invested in the market this last year in 2020, and in China, you were getting 47% returns on basic index funds. It was pretty incredible. However, if you were not in the market and you were someone whose job you experienced a little bit of career anxiety, you had some ups and downs in terms of your job, your savings maybe weren't what they should. We're talking about sort of the lower half of the population. There's more economic anxiety in that lower half than we're seeing represented in a lot of the sort of enthusiasm about China's consumer rebound. And I'm not trying to say that one or the other is the only case. And this is often what's so frustrating about China is that, well, is it one or it's the other? The answer is yes, it's both. And so on one hand, you have this incredible consumer rebound, and it's truly likely going to fuel global consumption. And you're going to see brands continuing to shift towards China consumers as they should. There's a real case for that. So that's an economic consideration. When I think about sort of the bottom half of the population, and it's probably closer to 60 or 70%, people who are less involved in the consumer economy, I think of that as real political concerns. So when you think about what the Chinese government and how they're going to legislate, they're very concerned about political stability, as they should be. And so the economic anxiety of that bottom 60, 70%, it's a wishy-washy number, it's more of a concept, is something that I'm paying extra close attention to as this year rolls out. And frankly, one of the great stories of the last couple of months has been Pinduoduo surpassing Alibaba in terms of annual active users. Kind of a BS number, forgive my abbreviation of my French. But it's a great reflection of Pinduoduo's popularity. Pinduoduo is a great example of a product that exists in China that doesn't exist other places, that's made for that bottom half of the population. Mm. And in part, their popularity for me is also a proxy for some of that anxiety that you're particularly seeing from new young users. Between January and June of 2020, you had the post-90s users on Pinduoduo increase 12x. Mm-hmm. So that's not driven because they just want a good deal. That's definitely part of it. But the reason they want a good deal is because they've been knocked around economically in ways that they hadn't prior in their lives. So there's an incredible consumption story, and we absolutely need to bang the table, pound the table on that consumer story. I also want us to be considerate of the part of the population who's hurting right now, because there's different messaging, there's different understanding, there's a different level of empathy that's needed for them that we won't bring to the table if we're just focusing on the people who were invested this last year who are doing their revenge shopping. Because there's a whole other half who's doing revenge saving right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And China is not recovering equally since the very beginning of pandemic a year and a half ago, right? When it just basically hit, and then the recovery started a couple of months later. The North has suffered in general. Also, these are all generalizations, but essentially North has suffered a lot more than the South, and South has rebounded. And here we have, as you said, revenge consumption and a lot more of this positive outlook. We have an office in Shenzhen, and you won't believe it. In the past 1.5 years, the salaries actually rose 30%. Try to hire somebody in Shanghai is pretty much impossible, wow. Right? All of these are very positive. But when you look at northern China, people are, as you said, they are in saving mode, and many of them were hit very hard. A lot of provinces are actually running out of young people. People are just trying to relocate and find opportunities elsewhere. And
it's a huge part of it.
It's a huge part of the story as well that is very often not being told. And that is why when you look at China, people say, "Oh, I have a China strategy. My brand is going to sell in China, whatever." Which part of China? Do you know your consumers? Do you know your niche? Who else is in the market? You really need to be very, very clear. Last question, Zak, because your light really wants to tell us something.
I know. I don't know what's going on here. I think this is like exit from stage left sort of deal. I appreciate everyone's patience. We just moved somewhere new, and I'm trying to work out. Every new place needs a Zoom studio these days.
That's no worries. That's awesome. The last question is, what's your take on the future of young China? Because right now, essentially, as we all know, there is globally a big demographic crisis for major economies, and population is shrinking, and of course it's an aging society in China, and People are not really excited to have more kids, even though right now we have a 3-child policy, and the government has promised that they are going to support with, tax breaks and education subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. So I personally believe it's not just about, financial burden that the child levies on the family. It's also in the changed mindset. People just don't want to have 3 kids or 4 kids or 5 kids. It's just different type of children. Both of them are likely single kids in their family. They were born through this 1-child policy, and right now you cannot expect them to suddenly want to have a much bigger family. And I believe that people want to build their careers. They want to also enjoy life. So a lot of things have changed. So what in that context is your take on China's future?
I mean, it's an enormous question, obviously, but let's talk demography. We're at such an interesting moment with China being at this critical inflection point. It's our contraction point, right? The size of China's population is officially shrinking. We all knew that was going to happen. Demographers have been talking about this for 30 years. It was an inevitability. China had the largest baby boom in the world, followed by the largest baby bust in the world, and that's why China's demography looks like this upside down pyramid. I'm going to keep going as I turn my light back on. This is people say they want the behind the scenes. I don't know if they actually mean it, but they're getting it today. So the 3-child policy, of course, is a thought to confront that. And I think you're exactly right. There's 2 issues. One of them is competition. I think when we think of Chinese competition, we think of it as a global issue, China competing with the world. The fiercest competition happens within China. If you were to, this was a major element of Young China, my book, when I was researching for that, you'd hear time and time again throughout the country that the competition to get into a good middle school, the competition on the high school market, the competition on the college market, the competition on the job market, the competition on the marriage market is all so brutal that it's defining of a childhood within China. And so when we were asking, back in 2016, when they were relaxing to the 2nd-child policy, when we would interview people, what we'd hear consistently is that a 2nd child would make both half as competitive. The financial element isn't just about money, it's about opportunity. It's about the opportunity that child is able to get. And there's no one who understands that better than the single child parents, because it's millennials who are parents now. We kind of forget about this. Millennials are still licking lollipops in some people's heads, but they're full on parents right now. And their childhood of competition, of getting ahead for the Gaokao, of getting ahead in college, of the difficulty of the job market, very much informs how they want to allocate their resources for their children. And you have to remember that China, and frankly, all of East Asia, spends more on their kids than the West, pretty consistently. Education, baby formula, clothing, toys, top to bottom, investing more in their future. So that competition absolutely informs whether or not people are willing to have 2 and even certainly not 3 children. Okay, so competition is part of it. The other element here is exactly what you're saying, which is just quality of life. I mean, demographers have a lot of different sayings. Demography is destiny is one of their favorites. Urbanization is the best birth control is also a phenomenal one. Because once people move into cities, they become consumers. And this is really, by the way, one of the big elements that pushes the government's effort to urbanize the country. And so people will consume. There's a huge relationship between the two. But once you become a consumer, you start thinking about things like quality of life. And it's one thing if you were to have 3 or 4 kids, if you're living on a farm in rural China and your kids were also your retirement plan, which was a huge part of why China had big families for so long. But today, when that's not the case, millennial parents are thinking, do I really want to, a 2nd or 3rd kid will change not just their life, it'll change my life as well. So to wrap it up, I mean, what do I see for the future of young China? I see an anxious younger generation right now. There is a lot of optimism. I think particularly when they look abroad, there's more and more contentment with what they have. But with that being said, when they see the sorts of opportunities that were available in the early 2000s in particular, you hear this all the time online, there's apprehension that the level of competition right now, and then the type of quality of jobs for an incredibly well-educated young generation, they're not totally there yet. So it's a young generation who's very much finding their way in a modern China, where the question isn't just how do I make more money, which was the older generation's question, honestly. They're moving from subsistence to existence. Now the question is, who do I want to be? How do I want to live? How do I want my kids to be educated? What do I want for my parents? How do I want to go into old age? How do I want to travel? I mean, those are luxuries that are identity questions that the older generations couldn't consider, but they're also questions that sort of cause a little bit of anxiety. You know, when people talk about going through an identity crisis, it's not like a fun process. China isn't in an identity crisis, but you are seeing a generation defining right now in real time, what does it mean to be modern and Chinese in the 21st century? Because this is really the first modern generation of consumers. It's the first modern generation of intuitive spenders, buyers, enjoyers of life. And watching them decide what that means for them. I mean, that's what we're all witnessing right now. So it's unfolding in real time. There's a lot that's undecided. I see more anxiety than I wish I did, but frankly, you see anxiety all around the world in young generations about what the future is going to hold.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you. It's a very interesting time, and we have exciting new realities in China. I mean, more and more young people are actually getting pets, and many of them are moving and choosing to be single for a while. And we all know that older people, older generation also, especially in northern China right now, also moves out in a big villa, and 3 or 4 couples live together and go and take pictures in the park and travel together, etc. So they redefine what does it mean to be Chinese, how do they want to live, and maybe for the first time ever they are really asking themselves, okay, what do I want? How do I want to do it? Because previously it was pretty much predetermined that you need to buy a washing machine first, and then you need a car, and then you need an apartment, and then you need to get married. Zak, thank you so much for an amazing chat. It was definitely extremely interesting to learn about China's demographics and what to expect in the coming years, and of course, China's innovation as well. Zak is the author of Young China and also the founder of the Young China Group. How do we contact you, Zak? What's the best way?
You can reach out to me on Twitter or send me an email at zak@youngchinagroup.com.
Yes, do get connected, and of course follow him on LinkedIn and other publications that Zak is publishing all over, most notably Harvard Business Review, his latest article. Definitely check it out. Thanks very much, Zak, again, and guys, stay tuned for more China experts to come.